For 10 long years, the most powerful army in the world had failed. A full decade, the combined might of the Greek kingdoms, the Achaeans, had crashed against the city of Troy, only to be broken by its impenetrable walls. Heroes rose and fell. Legends were forged in blood and bronze. Achilles, the unstoppable warrior; Hector, the noble protector. Their names became legendary, but the city itself never faltered. Troy was a fortress of stone and sheer willpower, and it seemed like it would outlast its attackers forever. Then one morning, the impossible happened. The Greek camp was empty. Their 1,000 ships were gone, vanished from the horizon as if they'd never been there. It looked like the war was finally over, but they left something behind. There on the beach sat a single colossal offering, a wooden horse. A silent, strange monument to a brutal 10-year war. The Trojans, exhausted and in disbelief, poured out of their gates. Some thought it was a sacred offering to the goddess Athena, a tribute that had to be brought inside and honored. Others, like the priest Laocoon, shouted a warning that still echoes today. "I fear the Greeks, even when they bear gifts." His warnings were ignored, just like the prophecies of Princess Cassandra, who was cursed to never be believed. Drunk on the joy of a victory they thought they'd earned, the Trojans dragged the giant gift into their city. That night, Troy celebrated. Wine flowed freely, and songs of triumph echoed through streets that had only known the sounds of war. But as the city finally fell into a peaceful sleep, a hidden door in the horse's belly slid open. Odysseus and a hand-picked team of Greek warriors slipped out into the darkness. They weren't a gift, they were a reckoning. They killed the sentries, threw open the city gates, and let in the entire Greek army, which had sailed back under the cover of night. The city that stood for 10 years against a siege fell in a single night of fire and death. It's one of the greatest stories of military deception ever told. A tale of brains over brawn, a strategy so clever it's now a part of our everyday language. But is that all it is? Just a story? For centuries, that's what everyone thought. The Trojan War was considered a myth, a great piece of fiction, but the truth is a lot more complicated, buried under thousands of years of dirt and time. To find it, we have to put down the epic poems, pick up a trowel and a pickaxe, and start digging. The man who dared to believe. For thousands of years, the story of Troy was exactly that, just a story. It lived in the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. But as the ancient world fell away, so did the belief that these poems were based on real events. Troy became a mythical place, like Atlantis or El Dorado. By the 19th century, scholars were all in agreement. Homer was a brilliant poet, not a historian. The Trojan War was a myth. But one man refused to accept that. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and to call him obsessed would be an understatement. Born into a poor German family in 1822, Schliemann claimed his life's quest began when he was 7. His father showed him a history book with a picture of Troy in flames, and little Heinrich vowed that one day he would be the one to find the lost city. It was a ridiculous dream. Poverty kept him from getting a formal education, and he started his career as a cabin boy. But Schliemann had a brilliant mind and a nearly superhuman talent for business. He made a massive fortune as a merchant and mastered over a dozen languages. By his mid-40s, he was fantastically wealthy, and he decided it was time to cash in and chase that childhood dream. Armed with his fortune and a fanatical belief that every word of Homer's Iliad was literally true, Schliemann set out to do what academics said was impossible. He didn't read the Iliad as a poem. He read it as a map. Homer said Troy was on a wind-swept plain, within sight of the sea, with 2 rivers nearby. Following these clues, and with some critical advice from a local British diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Frank Calvert, Schliemann turned his attention to a big hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik. In 1871, he started digging, And digging is probably too gentle a word. Modern archaeology is a careful, painstaking process. Schliemann had no time for that. He wanted Homer's Troy, and he was convinced it had to be at the very bottom of the hill. So he hired a huge crew and essentially dynamited his way through the mound. He carved a massive, ugly trench straight through the heart of the site, blasting through layer after layer of history with no records and no care. He tossed aside anything he deemed unimportant, pottery, walls, entire settlements, in his race to the bottom. Later, archaeologists were horrified. One famously joked that Schliemann did more damage to Troy with his shovel than the Greeks ever did with their swords. But then, in 1873, he found it, or so he thought. Near the bottom of the trench, he uncovered the ruins of a city destroyed by a massive fire, and right there, he found an incredible stash of gold and silver, golden diadems, thousands of gold rings, silver cups. Schliemann was thrilled. He told the press he had found Priam's treasure and had his young wife Sophia photographed wearing the jewels of Helen, creating an iconic image that made him a global celebrity. To the public, it was an amazing story. The self-made man proved all the stuffy experts wrong, but behind the scenes, there were problems. The artifacts seemed too old, too primitive for the world Homer described. The man who pointed him to the site, Frank Calvert, knew the layer Schliemann called Troy was from a much earlier period. And they were right. We now know Priam's treasure dates to around 2400 BC. That's over 1,000 years before the Trojan War was supposed to have happened. In his mad dash to find Homer's city, Schliemann had dug right past it, destroying much of it along the way. Heinrich Schliemann's legacy is complicated. He was a showman who often exaggerated his finds for the press. His methods were a disaster, but for all his flaws, he did something incredible. He forced the world to rethink the line between myth and history. He proved that Hisarlik wasn't just an empty hill. There was a city there, a real, ancient, powerful city. He put Troy back on the map and paved the way for actual scientists to ask a better question. Schliemann found a Troy, but did he find the Troy? Uncovering the real Troy. After Schliemann, the floodgates were open. For the next century, generations of archaeologists came to Hisarlik, but they traded his dynamite for brushes and careful scientific analysis, and what they found was way more complex and interesting than a single lost city. Troy wasn't one city, it was a layer cake of history. Think of it like an onion. You peel back one layer to find another and another and another. The site of Troy is just like that. Archaeologists have identified at least 9 main cities built one on top of the other over 3,000 years. They're labeled Troy I, Troy II, all the way up to Troy IX, which was a Roman city. Schliemann had fixated on Troy II from around 2400 BC, but we know the Trojan War, if it happened, would have been in the late Bronze Age, somewhere between 1300 and 1180 BC. So, archaeologists narrowed their search. Out of all the layers, 2 major candidates for the real Troy emerged, Troy VI and Troy VII. First, let's look at Troy VI, which stood from about 1750 to 1300 BC. This was a seriously impressive place. It had massive sloping limestone walls, 30 feet high and 16 feet thick, with huge watchtowers. Inside were large, well-built homes and a grand citadel. This city was a perfect fit for the well-walled Troy that Homer described. But there was a catch. When archaeologists looked at how Troy VI ended, they didn't find signs of a war. No layers of ash, no arrowheads, no bodies in the streets. What they found were cracked walls and collapsed buildings. The evidence pointed to a natural disaster, a massive earthquake around 1300 BC. It seems Troy VI was shaken to the ground, not burned by invaders. And that brings us to the next layer up, Troy VII. This city was built right on the ruins of the old one, and it had a totally different vibe. The survivors salvaged what they could and rebuilt quickly, but they were clearly terrified. The big, spacious houses were gone. Instead, people were crammed into small, tightly packed homes inside the city walls. They even dug huge storage jars right into the floors of their houses. This is the kind of evidence that tells a story. Why would you pack a huge population inside your walls and bury your food supply in the floor? You're getting ready for a siege. These people were living in fear. And this time, the way the city fell is chilling. Troy Seventy was destroyed in a wave of fire and violence around 1180 BC. Archaeologists found a thick layer of ash and rubble covering the entire site. They found bronze arrowheads, some still stuck in the walls. They even found human skeletons that were never buried, lying in the streets and houses, a clear sign of a slaughter so complete that no one was left to bury the dead. This wasn't an earthquake. This was a massacre. The timeline, the evidence of a siege, the violent end, it all lines up with the legend of the Trojan War. Today, the vast majority of scholars agree. If there was a historical conflict that inspired Homer's epic, the destruction of Troy Seventy was it. But the most incredible evidence doesn't come from Troy at all. It comes from clay tablets found in the archives of the powerful Hittite Empire. The Hittites controlled most of modern-day Turkey during this period, and they kept detailed records. In these records, they talk about a powerful kingdom on the west coast called Wilusa. Linguists are now pretty much all in agreement that Wilusa is a perfect match for the early Greek name for Troy, which was Ilios. In fact, the Iliad itself calls the city both Troia and Ilios. The tablets even mention a king of Wilusa named Alexandru, which is an incredibly close match for Alexandros, the other name for the Trojan prince Paris in the epic. And it gets better. The Hittite letters describe political drama and conflict over this city, Wilusa. And who were they fighting with over it? A powerful group of seafaring people they called the Ahiyawa. For decades, scholars debated who the Ahiyawa were. But the consensus now is that it's the Hittite way of saying Achaeans, the very name Homer uses for the Greeks. This is the smoking gun. It doesn't prove there was a 10-year war over a beautiful queen or a giant wooden horse, but it does prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that in the late Bronze Age there was a major city right where Troy should be, called Wilusa. It proves this city was caught up in conflicts with a powerful Greek kingdom called the Ahiyawa. The Hittite records give us the real-world context for the myth. The players were real, the stage was real, and the conflict was real. The verdict on the horse. Okay, so we have a real city and a real war. But what about the main event? What about the horse? Did the Greeks really build a giant wooden animal, hide inside, and trick their way into Troy? This is where history gets a little fuzzy and poetry takes over. Let's be clear, there is zero archaeological evidence for a giant wooden horse. Wood from 3,000 years ago almost never survives, so the chances of finding a piece of it are basically zero. For most historians, the Trojan horse as a literal object is pure myth. It doesn't even show up in the Iliad, which ends before the city falls. The horse story comes from later poems like the Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. So if it wasn't a real horse, where did this amazing story come from? This is where the detective work gets really interesting, because the horse itself might be fiction, but it could be a metaphor for something very real. There are a few great theories. First up is the siege engine theory, and it's probably the most practical one. Ancient armies built all kinds of crazy contraptions to break down city walls. They had massive wooden siege towers they could roll up to the walls, and heavy covered battering rams to smash the gates. These machines were often covered with things like wet horse hides to keep them from being set on fire. It's totally possible the Greeks built some new, impressive siege engine that was maybe shaped like a horse or just named the horse. Over centuries of retelling the story, A horse-like war machine that breached the walls could have turned into an actual wooden horse. A second, more poetic idea is the earthquake theory. This one is cool because it ties the myth directly to the archaeology. Remember Troy 6, the magnificent city that was likely destroyed by an earthquake? The Greek god of the sea was Poseidon, but he was also the god of horses, and crucially, his nickname was the Earth Shaker. He was the earthquake god. So if you're a Bronze Age person and your city's indestructible walls are suddenly shaken to the ground, who do you blame? The Earth Shaker, Poseidon. And what's his sacred animal? The horse. It's possible the original story was that Poseidon's horse destroyed Troy, meaning his earthquake. Over time, that figurative horse could have become a literal wooden one in the story. A third theory looks to the sea itself. Some scholars have pointed out that a certain kind of Phoenician ship was known for having a horse head carving on its bow. Perhaps the horse was really a ship, left behind as a supposed gift full of treasure, but actually full of soldiers. The Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving this one horse ship behind as a trick. And then there's the simplest explanation. The horse was just a brilliant piece of storytelling. Think about it. The walls of Troy were legendary, supposedly built by gods. They stood for 10 years. You can't just have the Greeks knock them down with brute force. That would make the walls seem less impressive. You need a trick. You need something special. The Trojan horse is the perfect plot device. It lets the Trojans defeat themselves with their pride and lets the Greeks win with their cleverness, not just their strength. It's such a powerful idea that we still use it today, from Trojan horse computer viruses to political metaphors. So what's the verdict? We'll probably never know for sure, but the Trojan horse was most likely not a real object. It was a symbol. A symbol for a clever weapon, a devastating earthquake, or just the power of a really, really good story. It's the poetic glue that connects the historical destruction of a city to its immortal legend. So where does all this leave us? We've gone from Homer's epic poetry to the dusty reality of an archaeological dig, and we've seen how the Trojan War, once dismissed as a total fantasy, is actually rooted in historical fact. There really was a Troy. It was a rich and powerful city, likely called Wilusa. We know it was destroyed in a brutal war around 1180 BC, right when the legends take place. And we know from Hittite records that it was at the center of a conflict between local powers and a great kingdom from the west called the Ahiyawa, the Greeks. The Trojan War probably wasn't a 10-year siege fought over one woman. It was likely a much more common story, a series of conflicts over trade, resources, and power. It was a clash of civilizations at the end of the Bronze Age, a time when the whole ancient world was in chaos. Homer and the poets who came before him weren't writing a history textbook. They were storytellers. They took the collective memory of a real traumatic war, the fall of a great city, the deaths of real heroes, and spun it into something more. They created a timeless epic about pride, love, loss, and the tragic cost of war. And the Trojan horse, it's the ultimate symbol of how history becomes myth. It might not have been a real wooden animal, but it represents a deeper truth, that the strongest walls can be defeated by cleverness, not just force. Whether it was a metaphor for a siege engine, an earthquake, or a stroke of storytelling genius, the horse is what turns the historical fall of Troy 7 into the legendary sack of Troy. In the end, the real story here isn't about choosing between fact and fiction. It's about seeing how the two are woven together. History gives us the raw materials, the cities, the wars, the people. But it's the story, the myth, that gives them a meaning that can last forever. If you enjoyed this trip into the past, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest stories. And let us know in the comments, what piece of history or myth do you want us to investigate next?